Capital punishment, or known informally as the death penalty, is a punishment of execution imposed by some countries in the world for very serious crimes, primarily homicide. The US, being one of the more common employers of this practice, has had a tempestuous relationship with this form of punishment. The traditional prison execution wasn't established until the 1830s in Pennsylvania. Multiple methods were introduced to help with procedure and reduce the potential for enduring excessive pain. Despite this, questions surrounding whether or not the death penalty is in fact cruel and unusual have persisted. The death penalty was actually declared illegal for this reason, as the Supreme Court found that sentencing schemes being used were unconstitutional in 1972, declaring an official moratorium on capital punishment and commuting all death sentences. It wouldn't last though. Just 4 years later, after multiple revisions and a series of court cases, the court ruled in Craig v. Georgia that the death penalty was now being imposed in a constitutional manner. Since then, over 1,400 people have been executed, but this practice hasn't been without further restrictions, such as the prohibition of executing the insane, juveniles, or mentally disabled. Due to various factors, primarily surrounding malicious legal practices, 288 death row inmates have had their sentences commuted to life in prison. Currently, 31 states and the federal court system allow for the death penalty as punishment, though the federal system hardly carries out any executions. Capital punishment, in and of itself, is a poor form of punishing crime for our country to use. To start, there's a plethora of evidence refuting any theory of deterrence, meaning an argument that a death sentence deters violent criminals from committing homicide. After years of study and analysis, the National Research Council reached a consensus that there is no evidence of a reduction in homicide rates relative to capital punishment, citing a conclusion reached by the majority of criminologists surveyed in 2009, as well as the inconsistency in the models and procedures used to construct pro-death penalty studies and show a positive relationship between the two. They state that the primary reason for lack of support surrounding those said studies was that they did not consider violent crime and murder rates for non-death penalty states as a fair comparison. The NRC provided said type of graph for demonstration, which showed that murder rates are continuously lower in non-death penalty states since at least the 1990s. They also found that in most cases, criminals aren't concerned with punishment, but whether or not they can get away with it. Another con not in favor of capital punishment is the concept of botched or wrongful executions. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, 276 botched executions have taken place from the 1890s to 2010s, at least 51 of which were post-Furman. The worst of which were the executions of Jimmy Lee Gray and Clayton Lockett. Gray, sentenced to die by the gas chamber, struggled and gasped with so much grief that even the witnesses had to be removed, being so horrified of what they saw. After 8 minutes, Gray loosened his restraints and eventually died from blunt force trauma after banging his head against the wall. Lockett was scheduled to die by lethal injection, but died 43 minutes later after having an adverse reaction and inducing a severe heart attack, as the drugs being used did not react well with his body. Wrongful executions have also raised a high level of concern when considering the death penalty. Cameron Todd Willingham was convicted of capital murder and arson surrounding the 1991 deaths of his 3-year daughters. Years after his 2004 execution, forensic analysis revealed that not only was he not the perpetrator, the arson likely didn't happen. To top it off, multiple witnesses refuted the prosecution's theory that he killed his daughters to cover up an abuse scandal. A final reason is the emergence of a consensus preferring life imprisonment as opposed to capital punishment. The Death Penalty Information Center states that only 56 countries retain the death penalty, with the US and China remaining as some of the few prominent industrialized democracies that will endorse it, and even that grasp is fairly tenuous. 106 countries have abolished it over time, including Canada, Australia, the UK, France, Spain, and most of Western Europe. Individual countries have not been the only ones to embrace an anti-death penalty statute. The UN has voiced very strong opposition to the continued use of capital punishment, and since 1999 has asserted that it is a violation of human rights. Officials have also gone as far as to campaign for the ratification of the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Political and Civil Rights, which requires that the nation-states of the UN abolish capital punishment. In a world whose social structure and moral constructs are constantly evolving, the idea of capital punishment seems to be an outdated practice. How can we inflict death upon those who commit the unspeakable without at the same time becoming what they represent? Evil and immorality.